When you picture ancient Rome, you probably see marble statues, grand temples, and men draped in spotless white togas. It feels like the most Roman image possible. But here is the truth. The toga was not everyday clothing. Most Romans owned one the way you own a tuxedo, rarely worn, only for show. The garment was heavy, expensive, and impossible to work in. It was reserved for politics, ceremonies, and public display. A costume for power, not a wardrobe staple. So why does nearly every surviving Roman image show it everywhere? What were ordinary people actually wearing while farming, trading, or marching across an empire? And how did one impractical garment become the greatest fashion myth in Western history? In this video, we will uncover what Romans really wore beneath the propaganda, who was allowed to wear what, and what clothing reveals about power, identity, and survival in the ancient world. Walk into any museum with a Roman collection and you will see them. Rows of marble figures standing in dignified poses, all draped in the same flowing garment. The toga appears so universal that it seems obvious. This must be what Romans wore, but marble lies. These statues were commissioned portraits paid for by wealthy citizens, senators, and emperors who wanted to be immortalized in the most dignified form possible. Workers, farmers, and shopkeepers could not afford sculptors. So the visual record shows only the elite in their most formal attire, creating a distortion that echoes across 2,000 years. Think of it like a modern politician posing for an official portrait in a tailored suit. That photograph tells you nothing about what he wears on Sunday morning. The toga worked the same way. It was the costume of public authority, not the fabric of ordinary existence. When Renaissance artists rediscovered Roman sculpture, they assumed the toga represented all of Roman society. When early historians studied ancient texts, they interpreted references to the toga-wearing race literally, imagining entire cities draped in white wool. Caroline Vout, a scholar of Roman dress, calls this the myth of the toga. She argues that historians and artists have confused representation with reality. The statues do not show us how Romans looked, they show us how Romans wanted to be remembered. Even the whiteness is a myth. Roman sculptures were originally painted in vivid colors. Togas displayed purple borders, red stripes, and rich dyes that indicated status. Centuries of weathering stripped the paint away, leaving blank marble that later generations mistook for minimalist elegance. The image we inherited is a double illusion. A formal garment presented as casual wear, color erased into imaginary whiteness, and beneath that illusion, a far more interesting truth waits. If the toga was a costume for ceremony, what filled Roman wardrobes the rest of the time? The answer is simpler and far more practical: the tunic. This basic garment was the true uniform of Roman life, a rectangular piece of wool or linen, unfolded and stitched at the sides with openings for the head and arms. It required no special training to put on, no slave to arrange its folds, and no fear of it slipping loose during work. The tunic was so fundamental that Romans had a word for the masses who wore it. Tacitus called ordinary citizens the tunic-clad populace, distinguishing them from the toga-wearing elite who dominated public ceremonies. This distinction alone reveals how rare the toga truly was in everyday Roman streets. Soldiers wore tunics beneath their armor and during rest. Farmers wore them in the fields. Merchants wore them in shops. Enslaved people wore them in households across the empire. The tunic crossed every boundary of class, gender, and occupation. It was Rome's universal garment. But not all tunics were equal. A senator's tunic featured a broad purple stripe called the latus clavus. A knight displayed a narrower stripe. A common laborer wore undyed wool, rough and practical. The garment was the same in form, but color and material announced exactly where you stood in Roman society. The historian Aulus Gellius recorded that early Romans wore the toga without anything beneath it. But by the late Republic, tunics had become standard undergarments for everyone. Some men wore multiple layers. The Emperor Augustus, who famously caught cold easily, reportedly wore 4 tunics at once during winter months. Women had their own version. The stola, a long draped dress worn over the tunic, marked a respectable married woman. But evidence suggests many women, especially those working or traveling, wore simpler clothing that allowed movement. The elaborate stola, like the toga, belonged more to ideals than to daily reality. For warmth and protection, Romans layered cloaks over their tunics. The paenula was a hooded cloak favored by travelers and workers. The lacerna was a lighter wrap for cooler evenings. The sagum was a rough military cloak worn by soldiers on campaign. In the northern provinces, trousers appeared, beneath tunics, a practical adaptation to colder climates that Roman writers mocked as barbaric, but soldiers quietly adopted. The poet Martial captured this practical reality in his verses. He described himself as dressed by oily Gaul in a common sagum cloak, contrasting his rough wool with the purple finery of wealthier Romans. His poetry reveals a world where most people wore simple regional clothing rather than the pristine toga of official imagery. Footwear varied just as widely. Heavy leather boots called caligae for soldiers, sandals for citizens in the city, wooden clogs for wet ground. The variety of surviving Roman shoes found by archaeologists shows a society that dressed for function first and symbolism second. Textile fragments that survive from Roman sites tell the same story. Researchers have found dyed wool in reds, browns, and greens. They have found linen tunics with decorative borders. They have found patched and mended garments that were worn until they fell apart. What they have not found is an abundance of the fine white wool that togas supposedly required. This was the real Roman wardrobe. Layered, practical, adapted to climate and occupation. No marble statue captures it, but archaeological finds and written records confirm it everywhere. The toga itself was a nightmare to wear. 6 meters of heavy wool, draped without pins or buttons, held in place only by the precise arrangement of its folds. One wrong movement and the whole thing could slip. Quintilian, the famous Roman rhetorician, devoted pages to instructing orators on how to manage their togas while speaking, how to gesture without disturbing the drape, how to adjust the folds with dignity, how to avoid the embarrassment of fabric pooling at your feet. This was not practical clothing. This was performance. The effort required help. Many wealthy Romans could not dress themselves in a toga without a trained slave arranging every fold. The garment demanded time, assistance, and absolute stillness. For anyone with actual work to do, it was simply impossible. If most Romans avoided the toga in daily life, why did it remain so visible in art, law, and politics for centuries? Because the toga was never really about clothing. It was about identity. To wear the toga was to declare yourself a Roman citizen, not just a resident of Rome or a speaker of Latin, but a full participant in the political body of the Republic and later the Empire. Foreigners could not wear it. Exiles lost the right to it. The toga was citizenship made visible, wrapped around the body for all to see. This is why Virgil called Romans the toga-wearing race. He was not describing fashion. He was defining a people. The toga separated Romans from Greeks in their draped himation, from Gauls in their trousers, from Persians in their fitted robes. It was a boundary drawn in fabric. The garment itself made this distinction physical. A proper toga required roughly 6 meters of wool, semicircular in shape, draped in precise folds that took practice to master. Wealthy households employed slaves called vestispicae, whose sole job was arranging their master's toga each morning. The complexity was part of the point. Only someone with leisure, wealth, and slaves could present himself in perfect toga folds. Roman leaders understood this power and used it deliberately. Augustus, the first emperor, launched a campaign to restore traditional Roman values after decades of civil war. Part of that campaign targeted clothing. Suetonius recorded that Augustus saw a crowd of men at a public meeting dressed in dark cloaks instead of togas. Filled with indignation, he cried out, "Look at the Romans, the masters of the world, the race that wears the toga." The quotation from Virgil was meant to shame them into compliance. But his campaign reveals something important. If Romans were already wearing togas proudly, why would an emperor need to demand it? The very effort to enforce the garment proves it was slipping from use. Augustus was not preserving a living tradition, he was performing one. Later emperors continued the performance. Official portraits always showed the toga. Public ceremonies required it. The garment became mandatory costume for senators, magistrates, and anyone seeking imperial favor. Yet outside the political stage, the toga kept fading. Writers like Martial complained about the burden of wearing it for morning visits to patrons. He called it endless exertion in a toga, suggesting that even the social rituals requiring the garment felt like exhausting obligation rather than proud tradition. By the 3rd and 4th centuries, the decline accelerated. The historian Ammianus Marcellinus described Romans of his era wearing colourful cloaks with embroidered animals and excessive fringes. The toga appears nowhere in his descriptions of daily dress. It had retreated entirely into ceremonial space. Emperors issued laws trying to revive it. In 382 AD, the Theodosian Code prescribed the panular cloak for senators rather than the traditional toga. By 397 AD, the Emperor Honorius attempted to recall the toga by law while banning trousers from the city of Rome. These desperate measures prove how completely the toga had vanished from ordinary use. The toga survived not because people wanted to wear it, but because power needed them to be seen in it. But the toga was only the most famous garment in a much larger system of visual signals. Romans did not dress to express personal style. They dressed to communicate status, occupation, and legal standing. Clothing was public information, readable at a glance by anyone who knew the codes. This system extended far beyond Rome itself. As the empire expanded, clothing became a tool for managing conquered populations. Provincial elites who wanted access to Roman power learned to dress the part. Adopting the toga signaled loyalty. Keeping native garments signaled distance. In the Rhine and Moselle regions, gravestones reveal how complicated these choices became. Some families appear in fully Roman dress. Others mix Roman tunics with traditional Gallic cloaks and jewellery. Still others reject Roman fashion entirely, preserving regional styles across generations. These were not random preferences. They were statements about identity, allegiance, and belonging. Ursula Roth, who studied provincial dress patterns, found that clothing choices often reflected profession and travel more than simple loyalty. Merchants who traded across the empire dressed in ways that made them legible in multiple cultures. Soldiers, stationed far from home, adopted local cloaks for warmth while keeping Roman tunics beneath. Identity was layered, and so was clothing. Women in the provinces faced their own negotiations. Some adopted the stola to signal respectability in Roman terms. Others maintained regional dress that marked them as rooted in local tradition. The choices carried weight. Wearing Roman dress meant something different in a frontier town than it did in Rome itself. Clothing in the provinces was never just fabric. It was a conversation between Roman expectations and local realities, played out on the bodies of millions of people across 3 continents. Roman streets had no identity cards, no uniforms, no printed badges marking who belonged where. But Romans could read each other instantly. The code was woven into what people wore. A glance at a man's tunic revealed his rank. The width of a purple stripe told you whether he was a senator or a knight. The quality of the wool told you whether he was wealthy or struggling. The cleanliness of the fabric told you whether he worked with his hands or commanded others who did. This was not accident. It was design. Roman law regulated clothing with surprising precision. The toga praetexta, bordered with purple, belonged only to magistrates and freeborn children. The toga pulla, dyed dark, was reserved for periods of mourning. The toga candida, bleached bright white, marked a man running for political office. The very word candidate comes from this garment. Women faced even stricter rules. A respectable married woman wore the stola as a mark of her status and virtue. If she committed adultery, she lost the right to wear it. Instead, she was forced into the toga, the garment of prostitutes and shamed women. The same fabric that honored male citizens was used to humiliate women who broke social codes. Cicero weaponized this association in his attacks on Mark Antony. He accused Antony of turning the toga of manhood into the toga of a tart, using clothing language to paint his enemy as sexually degraded and unfit for power. In Roman rhetoric, dress was never just description. It was ammunition. Clothing marked foreigners too. Provincial subjects who adopted Roman dress signaled their acceptance of Roman rule. Those who kept their native garments announced resistance or indifference. In border regions, dress became a quiet battlefield where identity was negotiated without words. A gravestone from Koblenz illustrates this perfectly. It shows an older couple in traditional Gallic dress while their children wear Roman tunics and togas. The family's clothing maps a generational shift in cultural allegiance, visible in fabric and style alone. Even colour carried meaning. Purple dye, extracted from sea snails at enormous cost, became so associated with imperial power that laws eventually restricted its use to the emperor alone. Wearing the wrong shade could be interpreted as treason. Romans understood something that still applies today. Clothing is never neutral. Every garment carries information about power, belonging, and boundaries. The toga was the most visible symbol in this system, but the entire Roman wardrobe functioned as a silent language, sorting people into categories the moment they stepped into public view. The toga was never simply an outfit, it was an image, a statement, and a carefully constructed symbol that outlived its practical use by centuries. What Romans actually wore tells a different story than the marble statues suggest. Tunics, cloaks, and practical layers filled daily life, while the toga waited in storage for moments when power needed to be performed. Rome's clothing was never just about fabric. It was about citizenship, status, gender, and control. Every stripe, every colour, every garment carried meaning in a visual code that sorted people the moment they appeared in public. The myths we inherit often come from what power chose to display, not from how ordinary people actually lived. The toga endured in art and memory, because emperors, senators, and sculptors wanted it too. The tunic, the cloak, the working clothes of millions vanished from the record because no one paid to immortalize them. Understanding this changes how we see not just Rome, but every image handed down from the ancient world. If this shifted the way you picture ancient Rome, let me know in the comments. What other Roman myths should we uncover next? And if you want more history explained through the hidden details of everyday life, don't forget to hit like and subscribe. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.